afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our Capital Markets and Investment Day, first day of the LSX World Congress Biotech Leaders Conference in 2021. Delighted to be joined by a panel now discussing the biotech listings boom. The conversation can be continued in the Q&A and questions function on the right-hand side. So please do ask your questions to the panel and to our moderator. We can get to them throughout the event as well as during the presentation itself. Delighted now to hand you over to our moderator for today's discussion, Frank Rahmani. So Frank, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate it. Thank you, Hans, Eliot, and Adam, for participating on the panel. As Josh mentioned, the purpose of this panel is to shed more light into the so-called public offering IPO boom, which is inclusive of the traditional IPOs. What you've seen, the emergence, or I should say the surge of SPACs over the past 18 months, as well as other alternatives of taking companies public, the so-called reverse mergers or RTOs. So we're going to be touching on each of these items. And we have the benefit of the panel that has gone through each of these permutations, so they can shed some lights and give us some lessons learned and the kernels of wisdom, if you would. I'm going to maybe start with you, Hans. You guys did a so-called more traditional IPO route, and also maybe put this to Eliot as well. In terms of the preparatory items, and there is, you see checklists that could tens of pages, 20 pages, that if there was one or two particular preparatory items that you could, that you would try to get ahead of for the purpose, and advise the same for the purpose of the attendees, whether it's the financials, the analyst connects, the preparation of the clinical story, whatever it may be, the one item or two items that you would suggest that really could potentially be the long pull in the process of taking the company public.
Sure. Well, thank you, Frank. Yeah, absolutely. Of course, this is about a lot of parallel work streams coming together at the same time, and they are all critical, right? So you need to have you need to have your financials, you need to have the banks lined up, you need to have the right investors interested in you. You have to have some internal already. You have to go out and find the new ones and those who can invest privately and publicly, et cetera, et cetera. You have to have the team, you have to have the news flow. So there are so many things that need to come together. I think, of course, overall, right, if you don't have a good science story to tell as a biotech, and you can show that you have some interesting products lining up, that is, of course, critical. But then getting the right investors interested in you is the key event. Without that, it's not going to happen, right? Today, the banks are expecting that you come with a basically fully subscribed deal to them, right? So you have to have those lined up already. So that I would point to if one thing, and that is also the hardest thing, maybe, because you need to get that crossover financing. That's almost all of the IPOs that are happening these days have a crossover financing somewhere within, between 2 weeks and 2 years before. And that is the aspect that took us the longest time, right? And we hear that also from other companies, that's really hard, and it's especially hard to get somebody to step forward, because all of these investors that are potential leaders in a crossover, they can invest publicly, they can invest privately, they have so many deals proposed to them. So why focus on your product? Why focus on your company and take that step forward and say, yes, I'll lead this? Because there are actually no advantages to being the leader of a crossover, right? You don't get any discount. You have to do the due diligence. You have to sort of you put your credibility on the line, and you do that with a lot of your colleagues. So that I think is, for us, definitely the most critical, and it happened just a few weeks before we did the IPO.
Makes sense. Eliot, your perspective, again, you may want to talk about your experience, which was not the so-called traditional IPO route. It would be helpful for the audience to hear how you guys ended up, your journey to going public, and some of the unique aspects and the one or two sort of gating or pacing items in your process as well.
Yeah, we went by the so-called reverse merger or R2O route, Frank, that you mentioned earlier. And look, I think some of the items that Hans has addressed is common across, I guess, all pathways. You need a strong investor suite. You need a good scientific story that's differentiated from others. We sit, F-Star Therapeutics sits in the next generation immune oncology space, and so you've also got to think about the vast number of other companies that are also playing in that particular space, and how all of that story comes together. And I guess there's all of that, plus in a reverse merger you're also doing a merger. So the merger part is real, and I've been through some very big mergers when I was in big pharma, and many of those aspects about integrating databases, people, patents are all also true of a reverse merger process. There will be elements of the so-called shell that need to be addressed. And so along with the preparation to be a listed company, and of course the difference, and we're a UK based company, between going reverse merger versus a traditional IPO route under the F1 is we go under an S legislation. So we become a domestic day one, no allowances for reporting as we go out of the gate. And so there's a lot of that preparation needs to go on before you get to that, because those the constraints that exist from SEC reporting, also the the guidelines that are offered by Nasdaq, you've got to comply with immediately. So for us, it was about getting that story right. It was about finding the right partner with which to merge and find the way out through there, and then finally really preparation with that reporting. And I guess the other thing that may be unique to us, because we're a company that's been around for well over a decade now, but also you will at some point need all of your shareholders to approve a set of documents. And you can guarantee that there is a shareholder who was, as a founder of the company, back in the dark ages, is sitting on 50 shares, but you need his or her approval. And find those people early, because there's nothing more frustrating than the whole deal being done and you're sitting waiting to have a phone call return from the 50 votes that are left, as it were.
Great. Thanks, Eliot. You touched on the merger aspect of the RTOs, and I think that's a really good segue into talking about SPACs and really the emergence of SPACs. We talked a little bit earlier internally about some of the numbers, and the numbers are astonishing. You look at 59 SPACs in healthcare and biotech just in the last 18 months, and 18 months through end of December. And I think, Adam, you mentioned there's maybe another dozen in the works that you know of, and how many more, and that number is going to blossom even further. And I wanted to maybe put this to you, Adam, in terms of what you're seeing, and we can then open this up to the panel as well in terms of some of the considerations of the SPACs versus the IPOs, and also the process and the timing associated with each of these, and the pros and cons as well. But maybe, Adam, if I can open it up to you in terms of what you're seeing in the SPAC market, and what you think are some of the drivers about this surge in the SPACs over the past 18, 24 months in life sciences in particular.
Yes, so I think direct listing, SPACs, all different mechanisms to reach the capital markets have been there for years. I think they've been dusted off and brought into the fine room, the dining room now, because of, I think one dimension is the complexity of reaching the capital markets. It's become quite complex in terms of regulatory requirements, but also in terms of cost, etc. The SPAC has been created as brought back as an alternative for companies to access the public markets in a different way. At the end of the day, listening to Eliot, listening to Hans, there's no workaround in terms of meeting the regulatory requirements that come with being a listed company. So that's why we as Nasdaq feel that this is more a complement, and we feel that, you know, it's good that there is a complement for companies to choose now what suits them best, because there are pros and cons with all the alternatives, but it's good that companies have alternatives, because depending on where you are in the process, what background you have, the investors you have, etc., you're potentially more suited to choose one of the alternatives. And the fundamental is that, you know, with SPACs, I think one of the key aspects, which is also fundamentally driving the IPO market, is the low interest rates. You're seeing now a lot of capital. Here, all of a sudden, you have a vehicle where investors can put their capital in the hands of sophisticated investors that have an opportunity to find an attractive company. And the aspect with the pro with the SPAC is there's a shorter time to market in the aspect, and there's a potential less volatility in the sense that it is ultimately an M&A transaction in its nature. You basically have a sponsor that has set up the SPAC, and you have a company, and they negotiate the terms under which they then become partners, where the company then takes the place of the SPAC and becomes a listed company. In the IPO process, you have really quite a transaction in the public environment, where basically you are then trying to find or define who will be your investor and how do you bring them in, and you're selling your story in a relatively framed environment, which is not always ideal, but seems to be working quite well, because at the end of the day, we had 300 IPOs last year, in addition to all the other SPACs. So it's not like the IPO market is gone. To Hans's point, a lot of these IPOs are already well anchored with crossover investors, existing investors. So it's not like they are super volatile in terms of being able to access the market. So I think, in summary, there are pros and cons for each alternative. One of the pros, of course, we touched upon that previously when we were discussing the research coverage. How do you get research coverage engaged? Because at the end of the day, there are a lot of companies listed in the public markets. How do you get the attention of the investors, not only for the liquidity event, which is the IPO or the day you list as a SPAC, but on an ongoing basis? You need to make sure you are targeting the right investors and building that dialogue. And research coverage comes into play there, and that's where the banks play a fundamental role in making sure you get that visibility. And especially as a foreign issuer, you need to invest more on the IRO side to make sure you are not only focusing on the existing investors you have, but looking forward and seeing who are the investors that you would like to have on board. How do you build a dialogue over time to ensure that they are following your growth story, and have the opportunity, whether you're trying to do a secondary at later stage, and you know, maybe bring them on board at that phase.
That's good, Adam. Thank you. It's you pointed something which I think is really important for the folks that are considering SPAC as an alternative, that from a regulatory framework and a timeline, generally speaking, the timelines are the same. That you still have to do the full disclosures, and you still have to submit to the SPAC shareholders for the de-SPACing transaction. And right, whether that's through an S4, F4, you do a proxy, however you do, you still need to tell the complete story for the target company in the same way as you would do an S1 or an F1. And you need to get to the same level of disclosures. So you're not going to get a pass, and the timeline is really not that shorter. And you also need to Eliot's point, you still also need to negotiate the transaction. Now, what you may save is that you may not be doing the 10, 20, 40, whatever TTW meetings, but you still are meeting with potential PIPE investors into the SPAC, and you're still certainly doing a lot of due diligence from the SPAC, and that itself. Now, one of the challenges, and I wanted to kind of bring this back, and you identified it, one of the challenges with whether it's the reverse or the SPAC is getting that, especially if there's a foreign private issuer coming into the U.S., getting that aftermarket analyst coverage. And some ideas or some suggestions that how you could do that, and you touched on a couple of those, Adam, one of them being you do a follow-on, right? And there's been a follow-on, you get the banks involved, and that could then anchor the coverage, among other things. But I wanted to, Eliot, we talked about this a little bit in the preparatory session as well, in terms of some of the some of the challenges with RTOs and SPACs and how you could mitigate and anticipate those in advance. And if you could maybe cover those as well.
Yeah, of course. It's a real question that one has to ask oneself as you're going through the process. At what point do you work with the banks and hope that coverage comes along? Of course, those things are not always tied together. In either way, you may get coverage without a bank and vice versa. And actually, how we chose to do it is we first and foremost hired a experienced and skilled IR head who works within the company. So we've got outsourced, but also a single point of contact for that. And what she has done is then, prepared a years long pathway for us, and it includes two major elements. One is getting the analyst coverage, and we picked our first analyst up. We finished our reverse merger late last year. We picked the first one of those up, and we're working through a process and doing all of the work that everyone has to do with analysts to convince them that the science is right, that it's different and valuable in the medium to long term. And so again, it's about the timing of the work rather than the nature of the work. The nature of the work is the same, and how one chooses to time it is according to where the deal structure. So for us, in a reverse, we're picking up analyst coverage now whilst we're in the market, and I guess for a SPAC, it depends on whether you use a bank to cover through that SPAC or not, whether that comes or not. And some do, and some don't. We happen not to use a bank from our side for the reverse merger. The other thing that's interesting, and Hans hinted at this as part of his first discussion, is the nature of the conversations. And we have talked to investors because we knew we were going through the preparation, but of course they're waiting until they see the deal go through, because these deals can, like IPOs occasionally, but these deals, because they're mergers, can be delayed or sometimes not even happen. And I would say there is a distinction between those pre-merger completion conversations with the same people as post, and that distinction is really to do with the fact that one is on the market and beginning to then tell that story from a listed perspective, and it's been very interesting to observe it. I would like to define what those differences are, and we've delivered on the things we're supposed to be delivering on, but we would have done that anyway. And I guess one of the things we're figuring out is the timing of and what we do with respect to continuing with that financing cascade as we go forward. So it's an interesting dynamic. I think the fact is that one still has the work to do. We went in by an S4 route that you'll be familiar with, Frank, and there's literally no less work than an F1 or an S1. There's no way around the SEC. I think Adam said that, and you've just got to deal with it. And in particular, if you're late to the game, and you haven't really thought that an IPO on Nasdaq is where you want to go, and you're a foreign issuer, then you have also the issue with different accounting standards and the look back, and from a reverse perspective, you're a domestic issuer, and so you need those 2 years look back, etc. And so if you haven't done that, then that's going to cost you time in advance of the transaction, that's for sure.
And money.
No, that's right, Eliot. Yeah, you mentioned that the preparation of the pro forma financials for the combined company on the de-SPACing is a major, and people end up in instances end up negotiating the merger agreement in a matter of days and maybe weeks, and then you have this big delay because you got to get your pro forma financials done from the SEC standpoint, and that itself, trying to get the two different standards combined and getting the right auditors to sort of opine and get to do so, that itself could take many days and weeks, and that ends up being a significant pacing item, especially with some of the SPAC considerations around. Hans, I wanted to bring it back to you, and you talked about the importance of the crossover investors, And one thing I wanted to really put this to the panel, and what we have not really seen is, or seen much of, I should say, is, and you've seen it more in the tech world, is the direct listings undergoing and cutting out the sort of underwritten public offering, the banks in the biotech sector. Is there what's the reason for that? I mean, you've seen it with tech, with obviously with the Spotify's, and most recently with Palantir. There's many examples, but we really have not seen that. Is there something about the underwritten and the banking relationships, the analyst relationships that are more so-called critical to the biotech story? Maybe that's what it is. Again, I'm just putting out what the idea, if we're going to see a change in that and have more direct listings.
Well, I guess the one difference is that we need such a lot of money, right? So we need to have both that crossover and the IPO and bring in a very significant amount of money. And the same goes for the reverse mergers. And you can see how the SPACs are becoming now. Like we have the first $1 billion SPAC now. And so everywhere that is integral. And I guess I have a hard time seeing how you couple that if you do a direct listing. And clearly, where if you're looking for bulge bracket bank help, right, then they will not touch you if you don't already have that golden list of investors that have signed on to participate in the IPO, right? So.
Yeah, I would like to add to that, Hans. I think that's an interesting topic. Direct listing biotech. I think direct listings is a proven alternative for very established brands, and well anchored in the consumer market, or a visible company in terms of its business model. So I'm not sure. We would probably see that more and more. I mean, BioNTech could have probably done that, a direct listing after the pandemic, but I'm not sure they would have been able to do it before the pandemic. But considering the visibility they've had, and that's just one example. At the end of the day, direct listing is again another way of coming to market. It's not a way. It's been introduced now, the ability to raise capital as a part of direct listing. Previously, direct listing was just a secondary. So it's just a transitioning of ownership. I would argue that for a foreign issuer in the biotech SPAC life science space, it's important to bring on new targeted investors that really know your company, because at the end of the day, it's a journey, and that journey needs to be understood. You just don't need, it's not just any investor that you want to bring on. That's otherwise going to the US loses a bit of its value because it is a costly exercise. And at the end of the day, you need to be making sure within this sector that I think the true value of the US system becomes when you are able to target knowledge, growth, experience, etc., that you're not necessarily able to reach in Europe. That's my take on it.
But Frank, I might just follow up on Adam's point there, if you don't mind, because I fully agree with it. Some of this is about mindset, and it's a mindset of the exec within the company that's going to market, and of course the current shareholders of that, and I guess there's a combination of that, sometimes the board. And for us, and I suspect it's true for those on the conference, one shouldn't see Nasdaq listing as the end of anything. It may be the end of being a private company, but that's really the only thing it is, and it is the beginning of everything. And I think it's a mistake, frankly, for companies, execs, boards to say, we can celebrate the listing, but actually it's not a celebration of the end; it's a celebration of the beginning. Because to Adam's point, if you come and say that we're done, then you may as well not have bothered coming to Nasdaq, because the real value in Nasdaq, setting aside the liquidity, is about that knowledge and experience. And we have conversations with investors who know more about the sector than you can imagine, and of course will also take you on in the depth of technology in ways in which one might not have imagined as well. And I think, that value then is about the beginning of that journey and building value for them as investors, but also value for you as a company being tested in that investor ground over time. So I would say one of the mindsets, aside from, to Hans's point, multiple parallel streams all going at the same time, all very fast and huge volumes, but one of the mindsets has got to be about, this is the beginning of a journey and certainly not the end of one.
Eliot, I think that's a great point, and the same point that Adam made as well, especially with the biotechs, given the insatiable need for capital, that whether you do a traditional IPO, you go through a SPAC, even if the SPAC has 100 and 200 million or more, or you go through a reverse merger with a funded company, and however way you go public, that itself is not by no means an exit. To your point, that's the beginning of the funding process as a public company. It gives you access to additional sources of capital, and maybe picking up on what Hans said earlier, the so-called journey to going public, the crossover investors serve in large part as a validation to the extent of so-called smart money for and provide also the demand for your TTWs, your test the waters meetings, which in part provides you with the anchor for your IPO investors, and which also in part then provides you the aftermarket. Once you go public, you want to do a follow-on. So this journey and having these touch points from your venture to your so-called crossover / venture to your IPO investors and follow-on investors, this is a very relatively small group in biotech in particular. I think somebody, I don't know, Adam, you may have a better idea of the numbers here. Somebody said that there's roughly 40 or 45 investors that represent 80% of the market of biotechs in particular, in terms of the biotechs that have gone public. That's a pretty, 50 investors basically, which is a pretty small number when you consider that all in all. So that getting that touch point is incredibly important. Now, let's talk about touch points. I want to bring it back to you, Hans. You went through this process, and we are still in COVID, and we probably will be for the next several months, and things are still virtual. And with that being said, the experience of going through your test the waters meetings and doing the roadshow and all that in a so-called virtual setting, what your experience is, and same thing with, Eliot, what you're hearing, and Adam as well, the good and the bad and things that you would advise people, the attendees, to consider as they're navigating through this so-called virtual process.
Yeah, I guess this was very much untested waters, right? Because we were all learning, the banks were learning, the investors were learning, the companies were learning as last year developed, right? When we talked to banks right when COVID broke out, the situation was there's not going to be an IPO in 2020. It'll be impossible. Nobody's going to invest in companies that they haven't met before, right? We need those physical meetings. And then, of course, that turned out to be wrong. In contrast, money flowed in, and there was a lot of interest. And if we are about to solve COVID, it was because of biotech, right? So both the vaccines and treatments all come from biotech. So everybody now knows biotech, and that certainly was also our experience. We had some meetings late 2019, the beginning of 2020. But we didn't start the formal process, neither of the crossover nor let alone the IPO, before everything was virtual. And of course, that was an entirely new experience from all sides. And for us, I think it was a great advantage because we filed as an S1, as a US-based company. But I could sleep in my own bed every night. We did, more than 100 meetings over the TTWs and the roadshow, but they were all done from my desk, and were of course extremely efficient. Just like the JP Morgan meeting that happened a couple of weeks ago, right? Lots of people were excited about the efficiency of of those Zoom meetings, one after one. I must say I missed walking up and down the streets of San Francisco and some of the receptions, but certainly I think we've learned a lot, and it's clear that the investors have a much more open mind now, and are willing to take very big bets on companies and people that they haven't actually met.
Yeah, and I would say, Frank, I have a shared experience. We started our process reverse merger well into the UK and global lockdown as a response to COVID, and of course we merged with another company, Springbank Pharmaceuticals, and the remarkable thing about that is we never physically met any of their senior team or board in order to do that. So not only was there a financial transaction going on, but at the same time, two companies were coming together, and all of that was done virtually. And like Hans, I guess in particular for those of us who are based in Europe, not getting on a plane to New York or Boston, or in particular the West Coast, having a 1 hour meeting, turning around and flying back is a significant advantage, because you can just do more, and it's also not expensive nor exhausting. I also, however, think there are real benefits, and I think one of the challenges we'll have as an industry is parsing out those things that are genuinely value adding with respect to the one-to-one or one-to-a-group meetings versus those things which are more what's the right word, a commodity type of meeting. And that's not to belittle any of the meetings that go on, but meetings that are actually much more efficiently held in this format, rather than all of that coming together. And I think that's something that not just our sector, but the the whole world's going to need to figure out over the coming year or two when we get out on the other side of vaccinations and COVID.
Adam, maybe that's very helpful, Eliot, in terms of and Hans as well, in terms of the observations. Maybe I go back to you, Hans, in terms of as you were talking about doing somewhere in the neighborhood of close to 100 investor meetings at all sorts. How informative did you find that maybe whether you do 40 or 80 or 100 of those? How much did the quantification of those numbers actually start refining the story over time, or did you, again, just talking candidly, did you at some point say, all right, within these 40 of them, I pretty much got 99% of the story refined versus that extra 40? We get this question quite often from investors, from companies actually, that talk about, well, I want my banks to set up at least 80 TTW meetings, test the waters meetings for me. And the banks are saying, listen, here's a 30-40, this is fine. These are who your targets are, and you'll do just fine with this. I'll be kind of curious your perspective of like whether the difference between 40 and 100 really made that big of a difference in terms of telling the story and refining the story.
Well, I certainly think it made a difference because we were able to build a very, very strong syndicate, both for the crossover and at the IPO. And some of those accounts that we spoke to turned around and placed much bigger orders than we had thought. So I would certainly rather take 10 meetings too many than one too few. That's for sure. In terms of how the story evolved, I think one of the things that of course you have to get used to in this process is the regulated environment that now you can only say what you've actually written in your prospectus, right? So the story was quite fixed at the time. I think we were trying to make it a bit more lively, not saying the same thing every time, which frustrated some of the lawyers, but certainly made for better meetings, and without the management team falling asleep from hearing the same story over and over. But certainly, I think it's always interesting to have these meetings because investors are exposed to so many different stories, so many different companies, so many different projects that we as executives never hear. Right? So they often come with an angle that you haven't thought of, or a suggestion that, and you also realize that something you think is very evident is not understood on the other side, right? And then then the story evolves, and you get better at explaining those complicated scientific topics, right? Well, we have a challenge that one of our targets is Galectin-3, which is not a receptor, not an enzyme, so it's a very atypical drug target, and therefore we really have to, and that whole explanation for why it's so attractive to block Galectin-3 evolved tremendously, I would say. So,
yeah. And it sounds like doing those doing 100 of these TTW meetings virtually is a heck of a lot easier in the virtual setting on Zoom and WebEx and what have you than it was going from Chicago to Boston to New York and elsewhere, right? So, yeah.
I might have answered you completely different had I been on a small plane traveling the Midwest, right? So, yes.
Adam, maybe you had mentioned some of the initiatives on Nasdaq that you guys are taking. You talked about some of the Nordic initiatives and others. It would be helpful to kind of hear a little bit more, and especially given the pockets of SPACs and really what we talked about earlier, which is this so-called biotech boom and the increased awareness for what it's worth that COVID has given us with the companies, with the biotech, and that has really taken a wider scale. And you touched on this as well, Hans. That has really taken a wider scale adoption. And the average person in the United States is really more aware of the biotechnology now and what really biotech means in terms of creation of therapies and vaccines and what have you. And what does that really mean from the sort of retail appetite and just the sponsor appetite all around, what you're seeing there in the markets, Adam?
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, this sector is always the most active sector on our exchanges, typically representing 40% of all the IPOs. And so this is a very dynamic sector. And the IPO market is just one piece of it, because if you look at the secondary market, that's where also this sector is very dominant and very active on a regular basis. So, and I think, the discussion about how to raise capital is becoming more efficient, different ways of accessing the public markets, but also different ways of accessing investors. So, I heard stories of biotechs here in Sweden, where I'm based, but covering the Nordic markets. There was, they were going to do a capital raise, typically targeted 20 to 30 investors. They had 150 on the call. It's, so, and this was, and they raised double the amount. Obviously a great company, not something that, everyone should expect, but they had done their homework, but the reach is there and it's a lot more efficient. And I think the way of doing the investment has changed, because the investors at the end of the day are comfortable now having this face-to-face dialogue through this vehicle, whether it's Zoom, Teams, or whatever it is. So that's one dynamic. I think the other dynamic, which is interesting, is, out of the 20 European companies that go to the US on an annual basis, 80% are healthcare driven or healthcare sector. And what we have seen is that, the dual listing concept is growing day by day. So you have a lot of smaller mid-sized markets that are supporting these European companies start their journey in the public markets locally. And then taking the next step, as they mature. Calliditas is a recent example from the Nordic markets. But I think what really makes the Nordic markets exceptional, and when I say Nordic markets, I'm really alluding to the Stockholm market in particular, is that we have such a fantastic equity market. So you're basically replacing the VC market with the early stage listing. Which typically you would argue, is this the right thing to do, because the companies should not be going public, etc. But it's actually not only a retail driven market, it's also driven by institutional that are willing to put in smaller pockets of money at an earlier stage. And now we're getting to the stage, where we've listed last year we listed 70 companies. Again, many of these life science. The year before 80, 90. It's been just a phenomenal run of years where we're seeing that these companies are matured and now ready to look at the US. And Galecto is one good example. We have the other alternative with Hans that chose to go directly to the US. But again, the appetite for the US is also through dual listings. I think that's an interesting angle. And I think it's starting to get more and more understood. And the appetite in the US for European entrepreneurs and science is very strong. They understand that there's some fantastic examples, everything from Galapagos to Biotech, et cetera, that have done fantastic stories and created a good footprint for European investors or entrepreneurs to access the US markets.
Thank you, Adam. What I'm hearing from everyone is that, and this is maybe the optimism, which is with a healthy dose of optimism is a good thing, that this biotech boom, we have to embrace it. It's here and might as well take advantage of it. And the SPACs have really afforded an alternative means of going public, but to be said, it's not an easier way of going public. It's an alternative route that's created more options for companies. And in addition to the traditional IPOs and the RTOs that have always been around. So, and this is here, we're embracing it. And given some of the increased awareness and also the insatiable appetite for capital all around, it seems like this biotech boom is with us. And so the party's still going on. That's what I'm hearing. But there's a lot of things that need to come in place. Hans, Eliot, you mentioned this, all the bits and pieces. This is a journey. Taking the company public is by no means the exit. I think you put it very well. This is the beginning of the sort of the next stage in the company's development, and we're off and running. So we're all excited, and thank you for participating in the panel. I'm going to open it up to questions. Josh, if I can hand it over to you, please.
Fantastic. Thanks, Frank. Yes, if you have any questions for our panel, then please do put them in the Q&A and questions box just on the right-hand side of the video there, and we can sort of look to answer them as we go through the event. Thank you, a huge thank you to Hans, to Eliot, to Adam and Frank as our moderator for guiding us through that session. I think it's, yeah, huge amount of great insight there, and so some great stories to tell. We are back again at 3 o'clock with our next session, which is focusing on infectious diseases and if the pandemic is going to affect investment partnering commercialization in that particular space. But with that, thank you again to our panel and see you again at 3 o'clock. Thank you.